Welcome to the weekly show Policy Beyond Politics, a show which discusses contemporary public policy issues and challenges. On this show this week, I'm going to discuss the difficulties and challenges faced by the street vendors community during the COVID-19 and how they are facing the unlock period. I'm joined by Mr. Prashant Narang, the Associate Director of Research Programs of Center for Civil Society, a public policy think tank based in Delhi, which is known for their research and advocacy work for street vendors. Welcome, Prashant, to the show. Today, we are going to discuss the plight of street vendors in India during the COVID time and also the lockdowns announced by different state governments subsequent to the national lockdown that we had seen in March and April. I know Center for Civil Society is doing a lot of work related to street vendors issues for the last so many years, and you are leading these research programs. So can you give an insight on the challenges faced by street vendors, not necessarily starting from COVID time? I can give a background of the challenges that street vendors were facing. And now, especially with this COVID time, COVID regulations, what are the challenges they are facing?
Yeah, thanks, Thanu. Thanks for having me here. So street vendors, street vending has always been a difficult source of livelihood in India. I won't go too much in the past, but even if we look at, for example, the 2014 law, the law says that no street vendor can be evicted until there is a survey done. And the local authorities are supposed to conduct a survey, but most local authorities have not conducted surveys. The problem is, there is no incentive or disincentive for the local authorities to conduct a survey, which means that if they don't conduct a survey as per the law, there is nothing that happens to the local authority officials. So why would they do that? The law was titled as Street Vendors, Protection of Street Vendors and Regulation of Street Vending Act. If we will look at the committee reports preceding the act, the reports acknowledge that there is a lot of harassment by the police as well as the municipal officials. And police as well as the municipal officials, they basically extort vendors. And the problem is very few vendors were formalized. So it's not that there was no law. There were municipal regulations or bylaws made under the Municipal Act. And but very few vendors were given licenses or lease rights, or they were formalized. And so most vendors remained sort of illegal. Not that they never applied. Many of them also tried and applied for the licenses. But municipal corporations didn't issue licenses or didn't even, for example, get back to them with a clear decision that, your application was considered and it was rejected. So there was not even communication of rejection to the vendors. So therefore, most street vendors remained informal and unlicensed. And because of their this unlicensed status, the extortion became possible. So now you see when COVID, the first lockdown happened, most stringent lockdowns in the world, as people have described it in India. And the immediate repercussion was that street vendors were not able to, be in the markets to be able to sell anything. Later, there was some clarification from the government. Well, vegetable sellers and fruit sellers are permissible. But for a couple of days, even they were not allowed. De facto, they were not allowed, or there was some ambiguity and they were not allowed to be there in the markets. And when they were eventually allowed, there was again a lot of confusion whether they would need curfew passes or they would need some sort of permissions from the authorities. And so, I mean, the old story of harassment and evictions, and there were photographs of vendors, for example, in Mumbai and Ahmedabad, where the police had overthrown their carts and vegetables. I recently heard from a vendor in Mumbai that the police confiscated all the goods, all the fruits and vegetables, and gave it to the patients in hospitals. Right. So I mean, there was no rule of law during the COVID situation. Number of things happened during COVID. I'll take you through them one by one. So first thing that happened was that's when it became clear to the labor, when it became clear to especially the migrants that lockdown is going to be there for a month or two, then many of the street vendors, because many street vendors are also migrants, so then they decided to go back to their villages. So a lot of street vendors that who were especially migrants, they went to their native places, right? That's the first thing that happened. Second thing is that only food and vegetable vendors were allowed, other vendors were not allowed. And if they were even locals, they could not do anything about it, right? So it was a problem for them that they could not continue with their livelihood. Then third thing that happened was, lot of people, for example, people like daily wage laborers or the industrial laborers that lost their jobs either temporarily or permanently, then they took it to street vending. And one interesting thing that happened is that vegetable sellers and fruit sellers made decent money. Why? Because restaurants were shut down, caterings were shut down, and on any given day in a city, a lot of people go to restaurants and to catering agencies, and they also cook food. But during lockdown, because most restaurants, especially in the initial phase of the lockdown, they were shut down. So the inventory of the fruit and vegetable sellers, those street vendors, went up, because now it's sort of they had the monopoly to sell. Most people were cooking at home, so they were buying vegetables, and also the supermarkets were shut, right? So fruits and vegetables, the daily supplies of fruits and vegetables were only coming from these street vendors and no one else. I mean, they were the heroes, if I were to put, because they were the ones who risked their lives, went to the sabzi mandi, the wholesale market, very early in the market, sometimes in the night, and procured fruits and vegetables and sold it to people, not just in other areas, but also sometimes in the containment zones. So we should definitely give them due credit that because of them, the city, even during the most difficult time of lockdowns, were fed. However, because of the ambiguity and because of the police approach, they had to face a lot of brutality and harassment.
Yeah. So Prashant, there are two things that it comes out from your understanding about the present scenario. One is people are getting into street vending because they lost jobs, while a part of a segment they gone back, so they are not there in the street vending anymore, at least for the time being. So how are we? How will it lead to some conflicts, or will it lead to some or it is going to add more challenges in the coming days? Because I think we are talking about some 20 million street vendors in the country, and now more and more people are getting into street vending. Whether our system has got the bandwidth and the capacity to oversee their vending activities, or will they be able to adjust to the new normal? What is your, how do you see the future now?
Sure. So, first thing is that there is no correct number, because as I earlier mentioned, that most states or municipalities have not completed the survey. So there is no correct number that we have for the total number of street vendors in the country. One number that we have comes from municipalities, local authorities that have completed their surveys. And that number is 15 lakhs, so 1.5 million. Recently, the government announced a microcredit scheme called Nidhi for street vendors. The scheme basically entails giving 10,000 rupees loan credit to each street vendor. This scheme was announced for 5 million street vendors. So the government estimates that there are 5 million street vendors, 50 lakhs.
Okay.
So identified street vendors are 15 lakhs, 1.5, and government estimate is 50 lakhs, 50. And then if you ask any vendor leaders, they say that, it's 2 crores or 1 crore and so on and so forth. But I haven't come across, because there has not been any census of street vendors, so we don't know the correct number. But even if you go by the government estimate, which is a very, very conservative estimate of 50 lakhs, there is still a gap of 3.5 million or 35 lakh vendors. So you see, the act has really not been implemented, so we don't know the correct numbers. Now the problem is, this microcredit facility, how would it identify street vendors? So it says that all the
So
street vendors that
you're referring to this package announced by the finance minister as part of the Atmanirbhar Bharat, right? That is the
yeah,
one you're referring to. Yes.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So during the lockdown, the finance minister announced measures, relief measures for different strata of the society, and for street vendors, the prime minister announced, there was a scheme called Prime Minister Street Vendor Atmanirbhar scheme, which
Right.
is basically sort of a micro credit scheme. They will give 10,000 rupees credit to street vendors. The problem is, how do you identify street vendors, right? Because so far, only 15 lakhs have been identified in the last 6 years. By now, states should have done their first survey. I mean, they should have done their second survey by now in 2020, because the act came in 2014. Every 5 years, there is supposed to be one survey. So by now, there should have been two surveys. But most states have not done even one survey.
Okay.
Many of the local bodies have not done even one survey.
Okay.
So the question is, how do you identify? So what the ministry has done, NULM and Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs, they say that one thing is, of course, street vendors who are identified in those surveys. Number two, if you are a member of any NGO, street vendor association like Seva, NATSB, or National Hawker Federation, then also you can be eligible for this credit scheme. That's a very problematic thing to say, because are you saying that these three organizations, the membership should be allowed, or any organization? So what is the objective criteria of selecting which organizational membership should be allowed? Then it also says that if you can get a letter of recommendation from the local body or a town vending committee. So then if you can get a letter of recommendation, meaning what? You can also create corruption, because who are the bureaucrat who is there in the local authority? If you're supposed to get 10,000 rupees, then he might as well probably take a cut, or he would ask you for money. So it's a difficult situation. And my sense is, if the government had allowed, this lenient criteria for certificate of vending, which is sort of a license earlier, then those people would have been formalized by now. So, this lenient criteria should have been adopted in the past for the purpose of licensing, because licensing, at least my sense is, licensing is not really cash money. It's not even credit money. So licensing, people would have got licenses, those who were interested. But here it's a matter of cash. It's a matter of 10,000 rupees. How do you make sure that a bureaucrat is not getting, not fudging records, or not getting false entries for the purpose of just simply taking money? That's difficult. But otherwise, the criteria is lenient.
Now with this street vending activities, initially the debate was on who will give the space for street vendors and all. Now with this increased nature of street vending in India, my question is about how are we going to look into the issues of street vendors? Because I see during the lockdown, post-lockdown, the unlocking times, right? So the guidelines that the different state governments, I'm not seeing specific guidelines for the street vendors.
Right.
And so the guidelines are there for retailers, the guidelines are there for organized vendors, the guidelines are there for even for a kirana shop. Was there any submission to governments for specifying the guidelines so that street vending could be a smooth activity during these difficult times?
Yeah, so recently, while interacting with street vendors, one street vendor told us that he's facing police harassment because what police tells him is that there is no guideline for that we have been told, so we can't possibly allow street vendors, because we don't know whether street vendors are to be allowed on roads or not. And he said that there should have been guidelines for street vendors as well. So then we took it up to the ministry, and we submitted draft guidelines to the ministry, requesting them to issue it to or at least nudge states to issue guidelines. My sense is, the larger issue is, of course, for the purpose of, current purpose of during unlocking, it makes sense to issue guidelines. But I think the overall issue is of police brutality. And you see what happened recently in Tamil Nadu with those trader shopkeepers,
Right.
the custodial torture and eventually the custodial death. Similarly, what you see in UP, what about the encounters? So the larger issue is of police accountability and how do you tackle that? Uh, so I think even if the guidelines are issued, of course, to some extent, it would be a relief that officially, the status would be then the street vendors are allowed and there would be no ambiguity. But it doesn't mean that there was no harassment before lockdown or unlockdown, right? The harassment continues. There was harassment in January or before that, there was harassment in March and April, and there is harassment now. So it's nothing new, and there is no such particular reason for harassment, or reasons may keep changing, but harassment continues. I think the government really need to tackle the issue of police reforms. The idea that this particular law for street vendors will protect them, I think I am not sure if this is the best way to approach street vending. You can of course have regulations, but you have to have some checks and balances for your public authorities, including the police, as to how you make them accountable. So whether it's police or whether it's municipal official, you have to have some systems in place.
So based on this 2014 Act, what do you suggest? I'm not asking this question not in particular about the COVID times and how are they going to survive during this period. But since you said, whether we have COVID or not, street vendors are always at the receiving end. So if you could summarize our conversation, what are the learnings? We are seeing pre-COVID and during the COVID, they are at the receiving end. So what could be the suggestion that you want to give to the municipal authorities or the stakeholders concerned, so that street vending is a very liberated activity, and also it is also vital for our local economies and all the city life, and also for millions of people, this is a livelihood issue. So what do you suggest from your experience researching on the street vending issues for the last many years?
Yeah, so there are two possible solutions. One is that let the community, the local community, take a call on where they want to have street vendors, how many street vendors they want to have, so on and so forth. For that, we need the lowest tier of governance. So, for example, probably Kerala has the lowest level of governance, but most other states have not implemented 73rd, 74th Amendment, and for this urban governance, 74th Amendment is much more relevant here. So that has not happened. I mean, your local community like the Mohalla or the RWA should be able to decide that. But the problem here is RWAs are not statutory bodies, and they are also they behave as if they are statutory, but they are not statutory. Resident Welfare Association. So they in fact bully street vendors in Delhi. That's another issue. The second solution would have been, the issue, the main issue, the underlying issue is not street vending. The underlying issue is how do you manage public spaces, right? So you have public space which has been used by pedestrians. It can be used by vehicles. It can be used by people who are just roaming on the roads. Sometimes it is used by, for example, people put up scaffolding for building repairs. Sometimes people just stand there on the roads. Sometimes for car parking or vehicular parking is one of the major uses of public spaces. Who decides? The first question is who decides, and the second question is how do you decide? So what I said in the first solution is let the community decide. And the second could be maybe the municipal corporation could outsource, can auction that space and can outsource it to an agency. Mm-hmm. It could be a cooperative or it could be a private agency, then can further, give it on lease. So for example, for car parking, that happens in Delhi. Okay. So the municipal corporations give the space, auction the spaces, public space, to the highest bidder, and that person then employs a couple of people with a ticketing machine, and they charge 20 rupees per hour from each car, right? Now this system doesn't require a town vending committee sort of a body which would have elected representatives, or so the current system is involves heavy administrative procedures and costs, and this is unviable, right? You have to have very lean and smart decision making systems, or otherwise you bring it down to the lowest level of decision, where people who are going to be benefited from street vending, as consumers or producers, they are able to decide, they are able to take a call whether they want street vending or not. For example, in my RWA, some people said that they don't want street vending, but there were housewives who said, no, we want street vendors coming to our doorsteps, right? Because they are the ultimate users, they are the ultimate consumers of street vendors. So I think the decision should be made at that level.
Thank you, Prashant, for your valuable insights and words of wisdom on street vending activities in the country. I'm sure your efforts and the efforts taken by Center for Civil Society in the last many years researching on street vending issues would be heard by the authorities concerned. Thank you so much. Thank you for your valuable time and your contributions in the dialogue that connects with the street vending issues.
With this, I wrap up this show. Please share your feedback and valuable comments. You can reach out to me on my Twitter handle Dhanuraj. Please follow the hashtag Policy Beyond Politics and also follow CPPR India YouTube channel. Looking forward to your comments, and with a new topic, I'll join you back on next week. Thank you.